The fall of Commander Xelur sent shockwaves through the core systems of the Xelur Empire. His name had been etched into the very fabric of the Empire's war machine, a symbol of discipline, loyalty, and unstoppable force. But when he vanished, some say defected. Others whisper he died protecting something he believed in. The tightly wound structure of Imperial command began to splinter. His last campaign had stretched the Empire's resources to their limits, drawing fleets from multiple systems and leaving vulnerable sectors exposed. Without Xelur's ruthless efficiency and commanding presence, the high councils of the Empire were left scrambling to regain control over a crumbling hierarchy. For centuries, the Xelur Empire had ruled through fear, strategy, and a sense of divine entitlement. Xelur was the executioner of that philosophy. His every victory had reinforced the Empire's dominance. But his departure didn't just create a gap in military command, it shattered the myth of Imperial invincibility. When word spread that Xelur had either turned against the Empire or fallen in battle without leaving a succession plan, whispers turned into open rebellion. System after system began to question their place under Xelur rule. Outposts that had once flown the Empire's crest lowered their banners. Entire planetary governors went silent. In the outer rings where the Empire's grip had always been weaker, pirate factions and warlords began carving out zones of control, declaring their independence or pledging allegiance to no one. The Empire tried to suppress the rumors, launching an aggressive propaganda campaign. They declared Xelur a traitor in some broadcasts, a martyred hero in others, depending on which systems they were addressing. But the damage had already been done. Xelur's image had been too closely tied to the strength of the Empire, and without him, people began to see the fractures in what had once seemed unbreakable. Loyalist commanders fought amongst themselves over who should lead the remaining fleets. Supply chains faltered, leaving entire armies stranded on distant worlds. And within the halls of the Grand Citadel on Archon Prime, the Empire's capital, political infighting turned lethal. Several high-ranking officials, sensing the inevitable collapse, began making secret deals with rogue factions. Some offered weapons in exchange for protection. Others sold out Imperial secrets to whoever could pay the highest price. Mercenary groups and alien insurgents that had long feared Imperial wrath suddenly found breathing room. Skirmishes erupted in the mid-sector regions, clashes not between the Empire and its enemies, but among Imperial remnants themselves. Some units refused orders from the capital. Others split entirely, forming breakaway regimes, each claiming to be the true successors of the Empire's legacy. Civilian life in many Imperial worlds descended into chaos. With trade disrupted and security forces redirected to internal conflicts, basic resources became scarce. Black markets thrived. Entire cities were abandoned. Some desperate citizens turned to local crime syndicates for protection, while others formed grassroots militias to defend their homes. The Empire's carefully crafted image of eternal control gave way to a new reality: fear, uncertainty, and rebellion. Among the chaos, the memory of Xelur began to transform. In official Imperial records, his legacy was buried under conflicting reports. But to many, especially those who had grown up under the oppression of Imperial rule, Xelur became something else entirely. In whispered conversations, he was no longer just a commander. He became a symbol. Some believed he had sacrificed himself to protect something the Empire wanted to destroy. Others believed he had defected to join a hidden rebellion, planting the seeds for a new order. His last known actions, refusing a direct order and vanishing into the void, were retold with reverence, even by those who had once feared him. This mythology gave rise to a dangerous new sentiment. If even Xelur, the Empire's most loyal soldier, could turn against it, then perhaps the Empire itself was not just flawed, but doomed. On hundreds of worlds, resistance cells began to form, not always coordinated, not always even aligned, but unified by a common belief that the era of the Xelur Empire was ending. These were not organized revolutions, but they were enough to destabilize the few structures the Empire had left. In this power vacuum, powerful corporate factions, alien syndicates, and long-hidden cults emerged from the shadows, each vying for influence over the collapsing systems. The Empire's once proud communication grid, the backbone, fell into disarray. Signals were jammed, relays destroyed, entire regions of space went dark. No longer connected by shared data or central leadership, Imperial forces became isolated. Some units surrendered to local populations. Others went rogue, becoming nothing more than well-armed warbands surviving off the ruin of the empire they once served. The disintegration of the Xelur Empire was not immediate, but it was inevitable. With every passing day, more systems broke away. Commanders defected, borders shrank. Former allies turned against one another. The final signal from Archon Prime, a desperate call for unity, was broadcast galaxy-wide, but received only by silence in return. The age of the Empire was dying, and all across the stars, something new was beginning to stir. In the chaotic void left behind by the collapse of the Xelur Empire, desperation bred unlikely alliances. Across scorched worlds and forgotten star systems, survivors of imperial tyranny began to connect through scattered communication bursts and encrypted channels. They came from every corner of the galaxy, escaped slaves from the labor pits of Zelgon 5, exiled scientists who had refused to weaponize alien tech, former imperial soldiers disillusioned by the atrocities they'd been ordered to commit, and entire colonies that had lived under the suffocating grip of imperial rule for generations. From these fractured, broken pieces, something began to form, something bleeding, wounded, but determined to rise. It began with whispers, then signals, then a name passed like fire through the shadows: the Crimson Resistance. There was no formal declaration, no singular moment where the Crimson Resistance was born. It was more like an evolution, a natural response to pain, to trauma, to the shared memory of what the Empire had done. Survivors began painting their ships with streaks of crimson, the color of blood spilled and lives lost. Crimson became the banner of those who had nothing left to lose, and everything to reclaim. Makeshift symbols etched onto armor and walls marked safe havens, drop points, secret meeting spots where fugitives could find one another. On some worlds, it began with coordinated food drops from resistance ships. On others, it was sabotage, imperial factories mysteriously exploding, comms towers blinking out one by one, slavers disappearing in the night. What made the Crimson Resistance different was its origin. It wasn't built in military academies or political boardrooms. It wasn't funded by wealthy backers or noble councils. It was born from pain. From the refugee mothers who carried plasma rifles while nursing their children, to the teenage engineers who hacked into imperial networks, using scrap tools and outdated AIs, every member of the resistance carried scars. And it was those scars that gave them unity. No rank, no bureaucracy, only the mission to ensure the Empire never rose again. In the early days, their movements were small but precise. They relied on stealth, speed, and asymmetry. Hit-and-run tactics, information warfare, infiltration and disruption. Former imperial tacticians taught others how to exploit the same weaknesses they once enforced. Scientists salvaged imperial tech and retrofitted it into tools of liberation: stolen drones, hacked war machines, and modified orbit jammers that could cripple a fleet's ability to call for reinforcements. In the dead zones between stars, entire asteroid fields were turned into hidden command centers. Underground bases sprouted up inside derelict ship hulls, buried beneath the ice of uninhabited moons. No two resistance cells operated the same way, but they were connected by encrypted mesh networks, by traveling operatives, and by a growing legend that their cause was bigger than vengeance. It was survival, rebirth, and maybe even redemption. Recruitment wasn't done through propaganda, but through stories. Survivors would gather in the ruins of once glorious imperial halls and share tales of their lives under oppression. They would light crimson flares at night, knowing that somewhere across the stars, another flare would respond. And the movement grew. With every strike against a remnant fleet, more planets found hope. With every liberated colony, more voices joined the signal. The resistance became more than a name, it became an idea, one the Empire could not track, could not contain. Despite the lack of central leadership, the Crimson Resistance began to show signs of strategic coordination. This hinted at something or someone guiding its formation behind the scenes. Ships that had once belonged to different rebel cells began arriving at critical battlefronts, just in time to support one another. Simultaneous raids were launched across multiple systems, targeting key Imperial infrastructure. Tactical patterns emerged that bore the unmistakable fingerprint of military expertise. The Empire, or what was left of it, began referring to this unseen coordination as the Crimson Mind. In truth, few within the Resistance even knew who or what was orchestrating it. They simply followed the signals, the plans, and the outcomes that led to victory after victory. But even in its early successes, the Crimson Resistance was not immune to conflict. Differences in vision, tactics, and leadership philosophy created friction among certain cells. Some factions believed in strict discipline, others believed in freedom and chaos. On one fringe world, a former admiral tried to declare himself supreme commander of the movement, only to be deposed within days by his own lieutenants. The Resistance had no room for tyranny. Its very foundation was rebellion against it. The Empire's remaining commanders underestimated the Crimson Resistance, dismissing them as fragmented insurgents, too disorganized to be a real threat. That assumption proved fatal. In a single month, the Resistance destroyed 3 key shipyards, liberated 7 mining colonies, and executed a coordinated blackout of the Marnex relay system, cutting off communications to over 100 Imperial outposts. Panic spread among Imperial ranks, morale plummeted. Officers defected. Whole battalions surrendered without firing a shot, handing over their ships and pledging allegiance to the Crimson Banner. The Crimson Resistance didn't just wage war, it rewrote the rules of it. They fought not for conquest, but for the right to breathe freely, and in their defiance, they lit a fire that would scorch across the stars. HFY was not a name written in Imperial archives or etched into medals of honor. He was a shadow, a myth wrapped in rumors, whispered about in military bunkers and refugee camps alike. Some said he had once been a high-ranking admiral in Xelur's own inner circle, one of the elite few who knew the commander's final plan before he vanished. Others believed HFY was never part of the Empire at all but rather a ghost from the early rebellions who had gone underground, watching, waiting for the right moment to return. Whatever the truth, one fact remained uncontested. HFY became the silent architect behind the Crimson Resistance's rise from a chaotic rebellion to a fearsome galactic force. No one saw his face. Those who claimed to have met him described only his voice, calm, deep, calculated, like a machine laced with pain. Communications came encrypted through shattered networks, always indirect, sometimes embedded in mission files, or embedded in the patterns of star maps that only seasoned tacticians could decipher. He never took credit, never asked for loyalty, but somehow his presence saturated every movement the Crimson Resistance made. Like a neural spine in a fractured body, he linked cells, predicted enemy movements, and wove together a rebellion from pieces no one else could have connected. It is said that HFY once stood on the bridge of an Imperial dreadnought called the Vigilant Ascendancy, commanding fleets during the siege of Varnak. A brilliant strategist, he had turned the tide of that battle with a 3-dimensional assault formation that rewrote the way naval warfare was conducted. But during the war's final phase, he disappeared, vanished from the records, court-martialed in secret, or declared missing depending on who you asked. Years later, that same tactical brilliance appeared on the battlefield again, but this time, it was not preserving the Empire. It was dismantling it. Under Kael's direction, the Crimson Resistance did not follow traditional warfare. He understood that they could never match the Empire in brute strength. Instead, they became a ghost war. They appeared in systems the Empire thought secure, hacked into defense grids, planted viruses in starport systems that opened bays mid-flight, causing massive collisions. Elite strike teams ambushed convoys not for destruction, but to retrieve data. Data Kael used to map enemy weaknesses and plan the next step. It was precision warfare,
scalpel strikes against the arteries of an empire already bleeding. Kale rarely issued orders. Instead, he sent suggestions, embedded in complex scenarios or simulation-based files. Resistance leaders would find their own answers within the scenarios, thinking they had chosen freely, only to realize later they had followed Kale's exact desired path. This method made him feel less like a commander and more like a force of nature, guiding, nudging, manipulating events like a grandmaster in an endless game of three-dimensional chess. And just like that, the resistance went from scattered insurgents to an organized, intelligent, and unrelenting force.
Some resistance members feared him. Others worshipped him. Stories circulated of his ruthlessness. Operatives who went rogue were never heard from again. It was said Kale had eyes everywhere, even among trusted resistance captains. An entire cell on the mining moon, Carthus 9, vanished overnight after they attempted to smuggle weapons to a private warlord. Their base was found weeks later, empty, silent, every door sealed from the outside with crimson markers burned into the steel. Kale's message was clear. The resistance would not become another empire. It would not rot from the inside. Despite his iron grip on strategy and discipline, Kale's philosophy was not built on fear alone. He believed in liberation, not just from the empire, but from the systems that had allowed it to thrive. He pushed for education in freed colonies, distributed knowledge networks through the resistance's dark web, encouraged scientists to teach survivors how to rebuild. To him, war was not the end but the purge before rebirth. In many liberated sectors, former slaves and prisoners began to live again, under makeshift governments advised remotely by resistance operatives. The red banner flew not just over warships, but over schools and refugee shelters. The most haunting rumor surrounding Kale Saren was that he had known Xelur personally, that he had once fought by his side, shared a vision, perhaps even argued over the future of the galaxy. Some believed Kale blamed himself for what happened to Xelur, for not stopping him or saving him when the commander vanished. It was this guilt, they claimed, that drove Kale to build the resistance, not to rule, but to finish something that had started long ago. To Imperial remnants, Kale was a phantom they could never catch. Intelligence divisions spent years trying to locate his base of operations, but every lead ended in decoys or traps. One fleet even followed false coordinates to a barren gas giant, where an entire armada was caught in an ambush orchestrated by automated resistance drones. Only a single ship escaped, broadcasting one sentence over open comms: "He knew we were coming." Kale Saren's influence spread far beyond military wins. He inspired a doctrine. He proved that structure could exist without tyranny, that intelligence could outmatch numbers, and that pain, when channeled through the right mind, could become the sharpest weapon in the universe. Even without a title, a crown, or a public identity, he became the mind of the Crimson Resistance, and the galaxy began to reshape itself under his invisible command. In the aftermath of Commander Xelur's disappearance, and the emergence of the Crimson Resistance, the galaxy entered an era of unparalleled tension. Power vacuums, ideological fractures, and old rivalries began to erupt into localized conflicts that threatened to spread like wildfire. The Empire's collapse had not brought peace, it had only removed the barrier that held centuries of resentment and ambition at bay. And it was in this volatile crucible that the first sparks of the star-wide war began to ignite. With the Crimson Resistance growing stronger under Kale Saren's shadowy guidance, its victories over the Imperial remnants began to draw attention, not just from those seeking liberation, but from factions with far more dangerous intentions. Across the stars, ancient warlords, corporate dynasties, and alien coalitions, long suppressed under the rule of Xelur's iron grip, saw an opportunity to reclaim what had once been theirs. The fall of the Empire had created a power vacuum so vast, it threatened to collapse the fragile galactic balance altogether. And where there is no order, chaos does not wait for permission to enter. One of the earliest signs of the coming star-wide war came from the Kelric Syndicate, a brutal alliance of mercenaries, smugglers, and black market warlords who had once served the Empire in the shadows. For decades, they had trafficked weapons, slaves, and tech in secret, protected by imperial blind eyes and mutual benefit. But with the Empire's network fragmented, the Kelrics seized key hyperlane corridors and established blockades across several trade systems. When the Crimson Resistance attempted to free colonies under Kelric's control, the Syndicate retaliated with overwhelming force, hiring alien bounty fleets and deploying experimental weapons that hadn't seen use in centuries. What was once an underground skirmish had escalated into open warfare across 3 sectors. Simultaneously, in the dead reaches of the Veiled Expanse, a mysterious race known only as the Oranthy emerged from the deep void. Believed to have vanished centuries ago during the First Expansion War, the Oranthy returned with vengeance encoded into their very biology. Entire systems were silenced overnight, as Oranthy biofleets descended on isolated outposts. Survivors spoke of shape-shifting creatures that could infiltrate colonies before launching coordinated internal sabotage. What made them terrifying wasn't just their technology, it was the knowledge they carried of the Empire's most classified protocols. Somehow, the Oranthy had accessed Imperial archives buried in Xelur's old vaults. They weren't just attacking, they were dismantling with surgical precision. The Crimson Resistance found itself fighting a multi-front war. While they had trained for insurgency and liberation, they were not prepared for the scale of full galactic war. Kael Saren's network scrambled to hold lines across dozens of star systems. Newly liberated colonies were fortified, not with celebration, but with desperation. Makeshift militias trained under crimson banners, while refugee fleets were converted into mobile hospitals and ammunition carriers. Entire moons became manufacturing hubs, churning out plasma rifles and drone swarms 20 hours a day. The Resistance, once a symbol of hope, was now being hardened into a war machine. Meanwhile, not all threats came from outside. Within the Crimson Resistance itself, ideological cracks began to surface. Some leaders, emboldened by victory, began to push for expansion rather than liberation. They saw a chance, not just to end the Empire's legacy, but to replace it with their own vision of order. Kael Saren, operating from the shadows, tried to quash these ambitions before they fractured the movement. He sent private messages, made examples of overly ambitious commanders, and rerouted resources away from factions, showing signs of power hunger. But the deeper the war dragged on, the harder it became to maintain ideological purity. War changes people, and for some, resistance began to look like conquest. In the Galactic Council of Varix Prime, once a neutral zone, chaos ruled. Diplomats argued over which faction to support. Some feared the Crimson Resistance would become the next empire. Others saw them as the only force capable of defending against the rising tide of warlords and alien powers. Several systems broke away from the council altogether, declaring independence and mobilizing their fleets in preparation for what they called the Great Divide. It was no longer a matter of empire versus rebellion. It had become a contest of survival, control, and dominance in a galaxy with no referee. The final straw came with the assassination of Chancellor Vemrakor, a peace-leaning alien leader from the Trenov sector, who had secretly negotiated arms support for the Crimson Resistance. His transport was destroyed by an unknown stealth fleet during a summit en route to Nova Holix. While no one claimed responsibility, the assassination shattered any hope for peaceful diplomacy. Entire star systems, fearing they would be next, began to arm to the teeth. Military production soared across all factions: Crimson Resistance, Kelric Syndicate, Oranthy Ascendancy, and rogue Imperial holdouts alike. The countdown had begun, and the first true interstellar war in generations was no longer theoretical. It had become inevitable. Within Resistance strongholds, Kael Saren began issuing new code-named directives, some of which hinted at contingency plans far more brutal than anything the movement had deployed so far. Battles were no longer about symbolic victories. They were about territorial control, resource domination, and strategic annihilation. Every planet, every moon, every orbital station became either a shield or a sword in the war to come. The Crimson Resistance, born from broken chains and hopeful voices, was now marching into something far more complicated than liberation. It was stepping into a battlefield that stretched across the stars,
facing enemies that no longer fought for survival, but for total dominion over a galaxy without its emperor. And as the war drums beat louder, and the stars themselves seemed to flicker under the strain of a coming storm, all eyes turned to the remnants of Xelur's legacy, wondering whether his last order had truly been the end or just the spark that would burn the heavens. The birth of the Crimson Resistance had been a spark in the darkness, ignited by the disappearance of Commander Xelur, and fanned into flame by Kael Saren's guiding hand. But as the galaxy fractured and war tore across the stars, something remarkable began to emerge, an identity forged not by conquest, but by unity, resilience, and a shared sense of destiny. What began as a desperate rebellion of fragmented systems became a culture, a creed, a movement that transcended borders, species, and past allegiances. The Crimson Resistance stopped being a faction and became a way of life. The red banner, once stitched from scavenged cloth and raised in secret meetings, now flew openly across liberated planets. It symbolized not just defiance, but remembrance of what had been lost, what had been endured, and what was still being fought for. Children born in resistance strongholds grew up pledging allegiance, not to a planet or a government, but to an idea that no ruler, no matter how mighty, had the right to enslave thought or silence freedom. Schools within the resistance began teaching more than survival. They taught history, philosophy, and languages, ensuring that every child understood the cost of tyranny and the value of truth. This cultural awakening wasn't orchestrated by any one person. It evolved organically, shaped by stories shared around campfires on asteroid bases, by songs sung aboard refugee carriers, as they drifted through silent space, by murals painted on the scarred walls of war-torn cities. Each piece of art, each poem, each cry of rebellion carried with it a piece of a larger soul, a collective memory forming across systems that had once known only division and fear. The resistance became more than its leaders, more than its victories. It became a mirror of the galaxy's wounded hope, finally rising to speak. Even in the midst of war, rituals developed. In some colonies, survivors lit crimson lanterns every cycle to honor those lost in the fight for freedom. In others, resistance fighters carved the names of fallen comrades into metal panels, salvaged from destroyed ships, placing them in gardens that defied the harshness of war with blooming alien flora. These acts of remembrance bound people together, regardless of origin. A former Imperial soldier could fight alongside a refugee from the Outer Rim, both knowing that their reasons were deeply personal, yet universally understood. What made the Crimson Resistance so enduring was not its firepower, it was its adaptability. When alien civilizations hesitated to join, fearing human-centric dominance, the Resistance adapted its leadership structure to include representatives from all species. Councils were formed not just based on rank, but on voice. Cultures long silenced under the Empire were finally given space to breathe, and in return, they brought new strategies, technologies, and philosophies to the table. The Resistance became a living tapestry, with every thread pulled from a different corner of the galaxy, woven into something stronger than any monolithic empire could ever be. Spirituality, too, found a place. Where the Empire had crushed belief systems and enforced secular devotion to Xelur's vision of order, the Resistance allowed faith to flourish. Ancient religions rekindled across the stars, some blending with new interpretations born from the chaos of rebellion. Temples were rebuilt beside war rooms. Some Resistance fighters tattooed sacred runes beside their squad insignias, believing their fight was not only for survival, but for cosmic restoration. This fusion of belief and rebellion added a deeper layer to the cause. It wasn't just political, it was spiritual. They weren't just fighting an enemy, they were fighting for the soul of the galaxy. As the Crimson Resistance expanded, it began forming alliances with unlikely groups. Former pirates who had turned their backs on plunder in favor of purpose. Corporate defectors who provided intelligence and technology once hidden behind paywalls. Even defected members of the Kelric Syndicate and splinter Imperial officers joined, each bringing a piece of knowledge the Resistance could weaponize. This melting pot of experience allowed the Resistance to predict enemy movements, dismantle propaganda, and bypass advanced security systems, with techniques no single group could have developed alone. What truly cemented the Resistance's identity, however, was its ability to endure loss without losing purpose. Entire colonies fell, starfleets were decimated, heroes died in silence, their names known only to a handful of survivors. But every time the enemy struck, the Resistance responded not with collapse, but with remembrance and resolve. There were no grand funerals, only the quiet recognition that those who had fallen had become part of the larger narrative. Their stories were passed down, encoded in songs, embedded in AI memory nodes, and inscribed on the hulls of Resistance carriers. The Resistance's evolution culminated in a symbol that began appearing across the stars, a crimson circle, imperfectly drawn, with a break at the top representing open rebellion. It began as graffiti on a burned-out freighter, but soon became the unofficial emblem of the movement. It appeared on flight suits, encrypted communiques, and even projected into the skies of occupied worlds by hacked satellites. It told everyone watching that the Resistance was still there, still fighting, still believing. From the ashes of Xelur's empire, a new identity had risen. One not built on domination, but on defiance, healing, and an unshakable belief in a future shaped by the many, not the few. The Crimson Resistance had become more than a rebellion. It had become the voice of a galaxy that had remembered how to dream. In the wake of Xelur's fall, as chaos swept through the stars and power-hungry factions raced to claim the ruins of a broken empire, it was the Crimson Resistance that rose, not just as a force of opposition, but as a unifying spirit. Forged in the fires of loss, betrayal, and impossible odds, it became more than an army. It became a movement, a culture, and a living heartbeat of defiance. Through every battle, every alliance, every sacrifice, it redefined what it meant to fight, not for domination, but for identity, freedom, and the right to shape one's destiny. As the star-wide war exploded into a clash of empires, species, and ideologies, the Crimson Resistance marched forward, not just to end tyranny, but to rebuild a galaxy that remembered how to hope, even in its darkest hour.